right. So, this is going to be our lecture for Crisis Intervention, Chapter 9, Crisis Related to Personal Trauma. And so I'm going to be making some references to our textbook. This chapter begins on page 173. And I am going to lecture on two of the kind of four big topics that are described in this textbook. So in this chapter, the author goes over and talks about sexual assault and rape, and then also intimate partner violence, child abuse, and bullying. And all four of these are related to incidences of personal trauma. And this is important to think about. It seems like we've talked about around this topic for quite some time in these last several chapters, but I think these are separated out specifically because these are kinds of trauma that people can frequently suffer from delayed PTSD. PTSD that develops sometime afterward, because these kinds of traumas have some certain characteristics. And so just to let you know, I'm going to be talking today about sexual assault and date rape, and then also talking about child abuse and child sexual abuse, just kind of briefly. I'm leaving out bullying and intimate partner violence. Those are really interesting parts of the chapter. They are things that we have talked a little bit about before. So my main focus is going to be on the two sections that I mentioned to you earlier. And I'll make sure that the testing is focused on that as well. If we have a test scheduled for this chapter, I really can't remember. Some other kinds of ideas about why these types of traumas have survivors that can suffer from delayed PTSD. And one of those is that often people who are survivors of sexual assault or intimate partner violence or bullying or child abuse, these are folks that may feel inhibited from seeking help. So where a person who has had a death, there's not much stigma attached to that. Where a person has had, other kinds of traumas. I'm thinking of military trauma that we talked about recently, but those folks are often inhibited also. I guess the point about this is that there are some special reasons that people who suffer from these personal traumas don't report it. So one of those is that they are inhibited from seeking help while the victimization is happening. So often these kinds of victimizations are humiliating. They are sometimes perpetrated by people who are meant to be our protectors, like our parents, or the people who are our caregivers. They also, sometimes involve some blame from culture. Our culture, definitely sexual assault can fall into this category, but sometimes people aren't believed as they report a rape or a sexual assault. We've definitely seen some examples of that this year with a lot of the Me Too movement, quite frankly, that's been in the media. These are, women, generally women, but sometimes men, who have reported being sexually assaulted or abused by someone long ago, and it was a person who was in a position of power, and so they really felt they had no personal power to report these assaults. And that's kind of the flavor of what we're talking about here with these types of personal trauma. Often also these types of survivors develop some sense of guilt, as if it's somehow their fault. Maybe it's my fault that I was raped, or my fault that I was date raped. I shouldn't have been in that position, or I shouldn't have been with that person, or I shouldn't have been drinking, or I shouldn't have I shouldn't have let this person, do this to me. And so people can start to self-blame, even children really can start to self-blame when that isn't really an accurate way to be feeling about this. If the victimization is perpetrated by a family member, so here I might be talking about child abuse or intimate partner abuse. If this victimization comes from them, there's just a lot of complication from that. Sometimes people don't want to bring their family to shame over this, and so they don't report these kinds of things that are happening. So that's really part of what we're talking about in this chapter is, survivors that you might meet in a crisis situation who have been the victim of some kind of personal assault or personal trauma and often haven't reported it or feel inhibited from reporting it. So there are some other notes that I want to give to you just at the beginning of this chapter. A lot of this data seems to be coming from around 2007 to about 2014. So, it's 2020 now. This book is probably actually set to roll over to a new edition, but these are the figures that we have. I guess we could assume that in 2020, 19 and 20, that maybe these figures are about the same, probably not going down, I would guess, and possibly having gone up. There are some interesting bullet points at the beginning of the chapter about victimization in general, and these are a couple that I wanted to mention to you. From 1993 to 2014, which is about a 10-year span, the rate of violent crime declined very significantly from 79.8 persons per 1,000 to 20.1 persons per 1,000. I hope I said that right, per 1,000 citizens. And so I guess that's kind of good news that the number of assaults or the percentages of assaults has gone down quite significantly in those 10 years. Another thing I think is interesting out of this category is that rates of domestic violence or partner violence are far higher than rates of rape. And so we can just assume that this is a pretty common experience for people who are sometimes in troubling relationships, not to be surprised by it. Additionally, lesbians and gay people report intimate partner violence and sexual violence on levels that are basically very similar to people who are heterosexual. And it's important for us to remember that, that there is a wide segment of our population. And when we talk about intimate partner violence, we're not just talking about heterosexual intimate partner violence. There's more detail about that in the chapter if you want to read about that. So starting out with sexual assault and rape, we want to first define rape. And there are many definitions of rape. I've seen many definitions through the years as I've taught out of different textbooks in this topic. But for us, in this textbook, rape is defined as forced sexual intercourse, which includes a psychological coercion as well as physical force. So rape is a form of forced sexual intercourse, and it doesn't just have to be physically forced or violent. It can also be the result of being physically coerced. Psychologically coerced into participating in sexual relations. And this can result from vaginal penetration, oral penetration, if you will, anal penetration, and sometimes by penetration by a foreign object. I think in the book your author uses the example of a bottle being used as a penetrating object. Rape is a felony. It's a crime that has the level of felony attached to it. Most people who engage in raping other people are not punished, and they most often don't really end up in jail, but it can be that kind of an assault. Almost no men report being raped by other men, And this is thought to be because of the suggestion of homosexuality or being or gay behavior, and that's a kind of just a culturally, still carries a lot of cultural heavy-weightedness to it, or abhorrence, I guess, and so men generally don't report that. And then defining sexual assault as a separate thing from rape. Sexual assault can include a lot of different actions. These are the kinds of things sometimes that we have heard about in this Me Too movement when we hear these stories reported. I'm thinking particularly of Richard Ailes, I think his name is Richard Ailes, the Fox News producer. Things like fondling, masturbation against someone, groping a person, but also making verbal threats and verbal statements can be considered a sexual assault. That's a pretty broad category, isn't it? So sexual assault, even though it isn't rape, it does have potential to cause PTSD in a person. Just as a rape causes our body to have this fight or flight reflex, sexual assault can elevate us into this fight or flight, fear for our lives, feeling extremely threatened. That psychological response is still a part of what somebody might experience when they're being sexually assaulted. So we know that when we have this activated emotional response of intense fear, that all kinds of hormones are being released, not least of which is adrenaline, but cortisol and other hormones. And those kinds of activations are a bodily response, and these sorts of emotions and remembrances can result in shock or disassociation during the event itself while the attack is happening. And these are the same conditions for other kinds of PTSD development, actually. So they're included in this chapter for that reason. If you look on page 176, there's a list of the most common emotional effects of sexual assault and rape. And I thought I would just, review those with us, as I might do as we were in the if we were in the classroom together. So if you were following along with me in the book, one of the common, I'll just go over these common emotional effects. PTSD. So PTSD, we know, is characterized by flashbacks, nightmares, a person maybe having severe anxiety, or uncontrollable thoughts about the event. These are common sorts of PTSD experiences. Depression can be another one of those reactions. Signs of depression after sexual assault and rape often include prolonged sadness, feeling hopeless, unexplained crying, loss of appetite and energy, loss of interest and pleasure in common activities. Feelings of hopelessness are common, which can impact thought processes and the ability to make decisions. Again, disassociation is one of those common reactions as well. We've talked about disassociation quite a bit in our class. It's that feeling that a person is kind of checked out from the real experience that they're having, almost as if they're observing it happening, or some people report it, as I've said to you before, as feeling like they're up above themselves and watching this kind of event happen to them. It's a protective kind of psychic behavior where we disassociate from the immediate thing that's happening to us, because the immediate thing that's happening to us is so overwhelming and really horrific, actually. So it's a kind of a defense, it's sort of a form of a defense mechanism, but extreme and not healthy. Substance abuse and misuse of alcohol or drugs can be another emotional reaction or behavior. This goes without saying that some people use alcohol and drugs for numbing unpleasant feelings, and so we can seek safety and security by just, medicating ourselves right out of this tension. Some other emotional and psychological effects of rape and sexual assault can be, specific if the person who is the perpetrator is somebody that the victim knows versus being a stranger. So if it's somebody that we know who's conducted this behavior, created this attack against us, we can feel anger, we can feel disgust and feeling very unsafe, even in our own homes. The person who's surviving this, if it's someone they know, may feel shock or numbness, and loss of control is a big thing for sure. A sense of vulnerability, and I've talked a little bit, I think, about already self-blame or guilt, and if I haven't, that's another big set of feelings associated with this. Also, a person can just start to feel a big sense of heaviness and sadness in their lives, and their sense of creativity and lightness of life, or being playful, or feeling like they can be playful people, can just go away. It can be this sort of feeling of the immersion of darkness. Sometimes people are kept awake by nightmares. They're maybe keeping so busy and active during the day, maybe even distracting themselves, and then when the quiet of nighttime comes and their mind is freer, bad memories can flash back, nightmares can develop, and loss of sleep is a common thing too. Also, some physical effects of experience in rape or sexual assault can include, when physical harm is actually done to the body, so bruising, bleeding, difficulty walking, soreness, broken or dislocated bones, sexually transmitted infections or pregnancy can be the result of these. Also in your book they state that about 5% of rapes can result in unwanted pregnancy. Okay, so interventions with a rape victim. I'm leaving the textbook now, I guess, and just going back to my notes. I want to remind you this discussion about interventions specifically is described as the empowerment model of intervening, and this empowerment model is supposed to be the best form of ABC response for crisis for people who have been sexually assaulted or raped. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about this. This is from pages 177 and 178. First of all, it is, I want to just emphasize that this model, the empowerment model, is just a variant of the ABC model as it's presented here in our textbook. So if we review and remember that we first start with A of the ABC model, A means achieving contact. And so doing so with a person who's had this kind of an experience requires us to be really sensitive. One of the big things that has to happen is we have to convey in our connecting with the client, making emotional contact with the client, that we are trustworthy, but we are also not afraid to hear about it, that we won't be overwhelmed by hearing about details of the attack, that we can take it, that we won't be shocked or disgusted by it. And I'm not really sure how I might communicate that to a client, but I just might say something like, I imagine the details of this make you feel pretty embarrassed, and I just want you to know it's okay for you to tell me all about it, and it won't bother me to hear you talk about it however you want. I might make a statement like that. I'm going to lean forward and just check the camera, touch it a little bit so it continues. So that's the main idea in thinking about the A part of the ABC response. This contact, this bonding with a client, as always in crisis intervention, just really needs to happen within the first 2 to 5 minutes. The client is, of course, sizing us up. They're deciding how comfortable they feel with us, whether they can tell us these terrible things, and we just need to be able to project trustworthiness. And so here are some of the most effective interventions or behaviors that we can engage in, using reflections of feeling, reflections of content. So saying something like, I know this is very embarrassing for you, or you might feel like you just want to tell all of this terrible detail quickly and get it out in the open. That's fine. Excuse me. Other kinds of reflections could be using reflections of content. So you might reflect back a fact that they said. Even if it's something that's kind of embarrassing or horrific to them, it might help the client for you to repeat a statement they made that involves some of this embarrassing or humiliating content. And as you say it back to the client without judgment, it can possibly make the client just feel more like it's going to be okay. It's helpful to use paraphrasing in this part of the connection as well. You know what paraphrasing is. It's a little bit more than a reflection of content or a reflection of feeling. It could be just, 2 or 3 of the last 4 or 5 sentences. And so you're kind of summing up the last little bit of what a person has said to you. This way they know that you are tracking them, following their story. Using open-ended questions is another very helpful way to do this connecting with the client in this circumstance. You might ask the client, what was the worst part of this for you? What are you feeling like now? How is it that you're getting along in everyday life since this happened to you? I might say to a client, how would you like to begin to tell me this story? Or how can I help you in my listening to your description of this experience? Also, it's important to ask about any symptoms that the client might be having. These can include, psychological symptoms, but also physical symptoms. It might be that as a crisis helper, you're just calming the client down and getting basic information, and you may end up, going with the client to the hospital if they want to have a rape kit done. And so you can be the one to report some of these physical wounds that the client is reporting to you. Then we get to B in the empowerment model, and this is on page 177, by the way. B she calls boiling the problem down to the basics. And here again, always in B, we're getting at cognitions. Remember, we're looking for what is the client thinking. What's the worst part of this as you think about it, we might ask. We're trying to get, of course, to the cognitive key. And remember, our whole reason to get to the cognitive key is if we understand the most disturbing aspect of this crisis to the client, then we can use cognitive techniques to help the client with the worst of the way that they're feeling. And that should make very good sense to you at this stage of our time in the classroom together. There are some suggestions for this section, this boiling the problem down to its basics. We can respond by using validating statements for sure, saying things like, I can imagine that this is the very worst thing that's ever happened to you, or I understand that this must feel like the most humiliating thing that you've experienced. We want to validate how the client feels. Their anger, they might not feel humiliated, they might feel mostly anger, or they might feel ashamed or guilty. So we have to kind of think about how to validate a client from the material that they're given to us. Also, using empowering statements is very helpful in this model. This is sort of referred to as the empowerment model. Because people who have been experience these kinds of personal traumas are often very much disempowered, it's helpful for us to think about making statements to them that are going to help them build their sense of personal power back into their self-concept. So I might say to the client, it's really brave of you and strong of you to come in here and talk about this, because this is what is going to help you feel better. Or maybe I would say, you're very strong now as you talk about this. And when it happened to you, you didn't have power, you didn't feel that you had strength. But now, as you're coming and talking about it, you're being a very strong person. And this is going to make you stronger and less of a person who's feeling weak or like a victim. I might say to the client, I like to think of you as a survivor of something, not as a victim of something, because we're going to work to help you move forward in this experience and your reaction to it. We can also make education statements. There are some descriptions of that in your chapter on page 177, but I'm thinking I might want to tell a client this sort of thing happens to many children. Maybe I'm talking to a child who's been abused. The child might feel a lot of shame around that, and I might say, this is sad, but there are other kids who have this experience. You aren't the only one. Or I might say to a child, grown-ups aren't supposed to do these kinds of things. Grown-ups are supposed to be our helpers, and the grown-ups who have been hurting you are doing something that's not right, and your parent needs help to stop behaving this way with you. You can think of other ways that you might make education statements around this. And then lastly, supportive statements are helpful here, saying things like, let me look at what the example is in the book. They don't give one. Hold on, I'm going to just double check the camera. Hang on, I'm going to make sure the camera's working. Yes. Okay, still on. Yay. In the book, when you turn the page over to 178, it wraps into doing some reframing. I again would say don't feel like you can't use reframing, but maybe be careful about reframes so that when you're using one, it's very carefully presented and it doesn't come off as sounding just like sugarcoating an experience. Maybe a reframe for a person who's been sexually assaulted could be, I know you feel very violated, and I'm going to hope that through this experience, by the time we finish talking, that you feel strengthened and you feel proud and capable because you were able to come in here and talk about this. Maybe that could be a reframe. Then we get to, of course, part C, which wraps over onto page 179, I guess, or, actually, I guess it's on page 178, the coping part of this. And remember all the discussions that we've had about coping and helping clients with coping. Generally, in the ABC crisis model, what we're doing here is first trying to find out what the client has used before that's been helpful to them. Because if they've used something that strengthened them in the past, they can call upon that resource that they already know how to use. And so one of the first things we want to do is ask, what have you done in the past when really terrible things happen to you? How do you survive it? What kinds of things have you done to take care of yourself in the past? And then, of course, we want to encourage the client. We might talk for a while about those techniques that the client used. Maybe they say, I've always talked to my grandpa about things. Or they might say, I have a journal and I really like journaling. Or they might say, sometimes I just take really good care of myself. Or I use prayer. Or I go talk to my minister. So if people are giving you this kind of information about what they've done in the past, we can help them make a plan to use some of those same techniques with this new situation. And then in the coping category that we work in, we also might ask the client if they'd like us to suggest something. And I would think that maybe having a new coping mechanism to use in this new situation, especially one of personal victimization, it might be good to teach the client something new. So I might ask the client, are you having a lot of problems with getting anxious? Do you find yourself feeling nervous certain times, or are you scared at night? And if those kinds of things are showing up, those sort of anxiety reaction things, I might suggest something like seeing if the client would like to learn about grounding as a technique for pulling themselves back together and feeling safe. Or I might suggest using some guided imagery, and I would describe what guided imagery is to them, and the client and I could together develop a guided imagery script that I could record for the client, or the client could record with me, we have such good use of technology now that in a counseling session, a client could pull open their phone and we could guide them to making their own